Griffinwood Press presents Primitive, a Bonebrake adventure, Book 1, written by David Wood, narrated by Jeffrey Kafer. Chapter 7. They set to work immediately, their spirits buoyed by the discovery. While Dave filmed, Slater took measurements and photographs, all the while discussing her thoughts regarding the print. "This print is 14 inches long," she began. "Not as large as most of the alleged Sasquatch tracks, but certainly large enough to be of interest to us. The toes are elongated with a pronounced big toe. The depth of the toe prints are not uniform, which is consistent with what we would see with genuine footprints. We don't tend to evenly distribute our weight when we walk, and certain toes dig in deeper than others, just like this print." She looked up and motioned for Dave to move in closer. "You can also see that the extremely moist earth has preserved portions of the foot's dermal ridges. It requires ideal conditions to preserve these ridges, and the fact that we only see a few bits here actually adds to the possibility that these prints are genuine. With a forgery, you're likely to see full ridges." She then set about making a plaster cast of the print. She placed a cardboard ring around the print, leaving extra space at the heel and toe. Next, she took out a small bucket, a package of plaster of Paris, and a large bottle of water. She mixed the plaster and water and stirred vigorously, explaining to the camera that plaster of Paris begins to set the moment it comes into contact with water, therefore speed is of the essence when casting a print. After banging her mixing bucket on the ground a few times to remove the bubbles, she carefully filled the tracks, starting with the toes and working her way down. She bit her lip as she concentrated on the task, something Bones found very attractive. When she was finished, she explained that the time required for the plaster to set varied depending on the dryness of the ground and air. In this damp environment, it would take a good hour before they could safely remove the plaster, though the curing process would continue for a few days as moisture leached out of the cast. They took an early lunch while they waited for the cast to set. Despite Bones' warnings that they should remain quiet, the crew was unable to contain their excitement. They chatted about their television show, wondering if further discoveries would merit a 2-part episode. Bones remained silent, chewing on beef jerky and washing it down with tepid bottled water. When Slater finally proclaimed the casting ready, she covered it in bubble wrap, slid it inside her pack, and they headed farther down the game trail. The air grew cooler and the vegetation thicker as they proceeded into the swamp. The soft earth beneath their feet gave a little with each step, lending to the feeling of heaviness all around them. The humid air seemed to weigh them down, and the moss-draped, leaning trees only added to the sensation as they trudged on through a maze of greens, grays, and browns. Little by little, the shafts of sunlight grew fewer and farther between, until it felt like twilight lay upon them, though it was barely midday. As they moved deeper, the musky, earthy aroma of the swamp gradually gave way to a dank smell. The scent grew stronger, and Bones stopped, crinkled his nose, and sniffed the air. "What is that odor?" Slater's face twisted into a Tom Cruise just invited me to church grimace. The scent grew stronger, pungent. Bones shook his head. "I don't know, it's not a... Get down!" Bones dove at the television crew, corralling Slater and Carly in his arms and plowing into Dave. The three fell in a heap to the damp earth as a rock the size of Bones's fist smashed into a pine tree where Slater had stood only moments before. Something flashed through the undergrowth, a shadow of indiscernible shape moving from left to right. "Get behind that log." Bones pointed to the remains of a fallen tree a few yards away. Slater and her team scrambled for cover while Bones rolled to his left as another stone flew. It struck the earth with a wet slap like a fish hitting flesh, bounced once and splashed into the stagnant pool behind him. What living thing could throw that hard? Either Craig Kimbrell had gotten lost on the way to spring training, or Bones was up against something entirely new. He drew the recon knife sheathed at his side and crawled in the direction where he'd seen the shadow moments before. What a time to leave my Glock in the truck. A third stone came flying out from the dense foliage. This one smashed into a rotten stump a foot from Bones' outstretched hand and stuck there. Bones snatched it free, rolled to his feet, and hurled it with all his might at the spot from which it had come. He heard a slap as it struck something soft, then a deep chuffing sound that might have been pain or surprise. Bones let out a roar of defiance and dashed toward the spot, zigzagging here and there to hopefully avoid getting crushed by another flying projectile. Up ahead, the underbrush rustled, the sound fading away as their assailant fled. Bones chased it a good 50 yards before slowing to a trot and finally stopping. He hadn't seen a thing. Whatever it was that attacked them had simply melted into the forest. It was gone. He supposed he should go back and check on Slater and the others, and then search for any tracks it might have left behind. He sheathed his knife and mopped his brow, and cried out in surprise when the earth gave way beneath his feet. Chapter 8. Bones had only a moment to realize he was falling before his feet hit something solid, or somewhat solid, because whatever it was his feet struck held for only a moment before it gave way, and he plunged deeper into darkness. He landed hard on his feet, pain shooting along his legs. A splintering crack split the air, and for a moment he thought he'd broken a leg, but he realized it was the sound of breaking wood. He rubbed his leg, and the pain soon diminished, leaving behind only a dull ache at the base of his spine. He looked around, the dim light shining through the hole where he'd fallen, illuminating a circle about 10 feet wide. He stood on a wooden floor, its boards covered in a thin film of dust. Beneath his feet, a series of cracks spread outward, and he took a step back just in case more open space lay beneath him. He took out his mag light and shone it around. No frickin' way. He was inside a ship, probably 16th century by the looks of the cannon his light fell upon. Sweeping his beam back and forth, he saw several more cannons, some still in their tracks, others lying on the floor. This was the gun deck of a large sailing vessel. He took a cautious step, and then another. The deck supported his weight. Encouraged, he began to explore. The fact that the deck still hadn't given way beneath all these cannons gave him hope that the structure was sturdy enough to bear the weight of one big Cherokee. He supposed he would find out. At the far end of the deck, a ladder led up to an open trapdoor. He tested the first rung, found it sturdy, and climbed up. He emerged in another sizable space. All around, the moldering remains of hammocks dangled from the beams that supported the main deck. Lying on the floor amidst the accumulated silt from centuries of leakage lay the skeletal remains of the crew. Some held pitted swords or rusty knives, while others lay curled in fetal balls. The ceiling up above was blackened with soot. Apparently the crew had made their homes here after being run aground, but how in the hell had a ship gotten this far inland? Must have been one hell of a storm, he mumbled. He shone his beam down to the far end of the deck, where a door hung haphazardly on broken hinges. That would be the officers' quarters. He picked his way across the deck, reluctant to tread on the remains of the deceased. As he skirted the bones of the soldier nearest him, he did a double take. The back of the man's skull had been smashed in, leaving a baseball-sized hole. What in the... He knelt for a closer look. The back of the skull had been caved in. Fragments of bone lay inside the hollow of the cranium. Whatever had delivered the fatal blow had compressed the skull. The victim had died lying face down, and as the soft tissue decayed, the fragments of bone had simply fallen into the hollow space once occupied by the brain. "Sorry, bro," he said. "That's a nasty way to die." He stood and resumed his careful trek. It quickly became apparent that every member of the crew had died in the same way, their skulls crushed by a blunt object. He shivered, the fresh memory of flying stones strong in his mind. This ship had been here for a good 400 years. Could there possibly be a connection? He didn't want to believe it, but he knew better than to dismiss the improbable. "Bones!" Slater's voice called out from somewhere above. "Where are you?" "I'm down here," he called. "But don't come any closer, the ground's not stable." He moved toward the hole through which he'd initially tumbled, but before he could get there, a pair of hiking boots slid through the opening, followed by trim, deeply tanned legs. Slater. "Hold on a second. There's a hole right below your feet and you'll fall through if you're not careful. Believe me, I know from experience." He hurried over to her, stumbling over the rib cage of a dead sailor. He reached up, grabbed Slater by the waist, and guided her down to the deck. Her eyes grew wide as she took in their surroundings. "Where are we?" she marveled. "Inside an old sailing ship. I'm not sure what kind exactly." Slater rounded on him, hands on hips. "A sailing ship, underground. Are you winding me up?" "Nope. Check it out." He swept his light across the deck and over the remains of the crew. "Wow," Slater gaped, her voice soft and her eyes wide. "How do you think it got here?" The only theory I can come up with is one hell of a hurricane carried them inland and they got stuck here when the water receded. It looks like they decided to live inside the ship. You can see they had fires in here." He pointed to the blackened beams up above. "Over time, it sank down into the swamp and the mud preserved it." "This is amazing. I don't care if it has nothing to do with a skunk ape. It's still going to make for an amazing story." She turned and barked out a sharp command. "Dave, Carly, get down here. I want this all on video." "Be careful," Bones called. "Let me help." With a hollow crack, the main deck above them gave way again, and Dave came crashing down on top of them. Bones managed to wrap his arms around the young cameraman and partially slowed his fall, but Dave still landed hard on his backside. Bones froze, wondering if the force of the fall would cause the deck to give way again. This time it held. Carly followed more carefully than her colleague. Bones sat her down lightly on her feet, and she stared in wide-eyed amazement at the macabre scene. "This is like a haunted house," she breathed. "More like the Pirates of the Caribbean, right?" Dave said, climbing to his feet. "You know the part where they all turn into skeletons? How about we focus on doing our jobs?" Slater rode over her crew's conversation. "You can talk about amusement parks later." "Sorry." Dave's gaze dropped to the floor, but he brightened almost immediately. "This is going to be some of the best footage we've ever gotten." He made a slow circuit of the deck, recording every inch of the bizarre scene. He lingered over the fire pit in the center. The crew had piled a thick layer of sand on the deck to prevent the wood from catching fire. Chunks of bone poked out from the silt and ash. When Slater was satisfied that they had enough footage, they moved on to the officers' quarters. Inside, they found more skeletal remains, all with smashed skulls. "It's strange," Slater observed, "that some are lying curled up in a ball. Do you think they just curled up and waited to be killed?" "Possibly," Bones said, "if they were frightened enough. We don't know how long they hold up here. It's possible some of the crew are already dead from malnutrition or disease, and whoever did this to them bashed their heads in just to make sure." "Scary stuff." Slater led her crew around the cabin, commenting on the few artifacts she found lying about. The officers' personal effects were few, but among them were knives, rings, Spanish coins, and crumbling Bibles. "It's clearly a Spanish galleon, and the fact that things like this remain," she held up a fat gold coin, "proves that we are the first to find it. If its presence had been discovered before, it's almost a guarantee the valuables would be long gone." They ascended to the captain's cabin, which lay just above the officers' quarters. The door was wedged closed, and Bones finally resorted to main force to smash open the top half of the decaying wood. "Looks like somebody blocked themselves in," he said, looking down at the footlocker and small chest that pushed up against the base of the door. But that wasn't the only thing that had held the door fast. Here the intrusion of years of silt was clearly evident, as a thick layer of dried black muck caked the floor. Bones climbed over the remaining portion of the door and then helped the others in. The captain lay on his bed, his empty eye sockets gazing up at the ceiling. Dave moved in with a camera while Slater resumed her hosting duties. "At first glance, it looks like the captain also had his skull smashed." She pointed at his shattered left temple. "But that isn't the case. If you look at the other side of his head, you'll see a smaller hole. And then there's this." She pointed at an object half buried in the muck. "It's a pistol, lying roughly where it would have fallen from limp, dead fingers." "So he barred himself inside and took his own life." Dave said the words slowly, as if trying to convince himself of their veracity. "Whatever was outside that door was more terrible than the prospect of suicide." Slater turned to Bones. "Can you tell us anything about the gun?" "It's a matchlock." Bones knelt beside the weapon, but left it untouched. "The match cord, which was just a burning wick, went here." He pointed to the hammer. "It came down and hit the flash pan, which ignited the gunpowder. That's about all I can tell you." "Does the type of gun give us any clue as to the age of the wreck?" Bones nodded. "By the early 1600s, matchlocks were out and flintlocks were in, so this is probably 16th century. An inspection of the captain's truck revealed little of interest, but the small chest was filled with coins, many of them silver and gold. Bones resisted the urge to pocket a few, maybe when the camera was no longer rolling. "Where to next?" Slater asked. "All the way to the bottom," Bones said. "What do you expect to find down there?" He grinned. "The cargo hold." Chapter 9. Of all the various parts of the galleon, The cargo hold had suffered the most from the intrusion of soil and water. Toward the bow of the ship, where the hull had been split when the ship ran aground, the dark mud lay knee-deep, descending to a depth of several inches toward the stern. But it did little to cover the crates that lay all around, scattered and broken by the wreck so many centuries ago. Carly clapped her hands, and Dave let out a whoop of triumph as the beam of Bones' light glinted off blocks of gold and silver bullion and scattered gold chains. Here and there jewels sparkled like stars in the dark mire. Trying but failing to suppress a grin, Slater discussed the find at length for the benefit of the camera. "Why so many gold chains?" Dave asked. Bones knew the answer to this one. Tax evasion. The Spanish crown placed a tariff on precious metals, but jewelry was exempt. Europeans didn't do much in the way of fine craftsmanship in the New World, but they could make rough chains and rings like what you see here, and that was good enough to get around the law. "Why not make it all into jewelry?" Carly asked. "I guess it's one of those things you can only take so far. The Crown would look past a certain amount of circumvention as long as it made its share from the transportation of New World treasure. But if it got out of hand, they'd have eliminated the exemption. Nobody wanted to be the one that killed the goose that laid the golden egg." "Speaking of eggs," Slater said, "have you seen anything like this before?" She pointed to a small crate filled with dirt, straw, and mud-encrusted egg-shaped objects caked in mud. "I've never seen one up close, but I've read about them." He knelt beside the crate, took out his recon knife, and scraped away the mud that encased one of the strange objects. "These are bezoars." "You're kidding," Dave and Carly said in unison. "What are bezoars?" Slater asked. "Somebody hasn't read Harry Potter," Dave said. "A bezoar is a sort of stone formed from material found in the digestive tracts of two-stomached animals. Given that this is a Spanish ship, we're probably looking at stones from a llama or alpaca, since those were found in the major Spanish colonies. And just like in Harry Potter, people believed a bezoar could absorb poison. Somebody rich enough to buy one would dip it in his cup of wine before drinking it, just in case his enemies had tried to poison his cup." "I take it they were pretty valuable?" Slater asked. "Very, and not just because of their supposed properties. Being able to afford one was a status symbol. People would have them carved, mounted in a gold setting, and would wear them as jewelry." "Did they work?" Dave asked. "I mean, do they really absorb poison?" Bones chuckled. "Tell you what. When we get back to town, we'll put rat poison in a beer, drop one of these in, and you can drink it. Sound good?" Dave laughed. "I'll pass." With that pronouncement, he cut the camera. "Does this mean we get, salvage rights or whatever?" They all looked at Bones, the only treasure hunter in the group. "If we were 3 leagues out in the Gulf waters or 3 miles off the Atlantic coast, things would be a lot simpler. On land, it's a little more complicated." "But finders keepers, right?" Carly asked. "Not necessarily. A lot depends on who owns the property. If we're still inside the state park, Florida Treasure Trove law says that whatever we find belongs to the state." "That's not fair," Dave said. "That's just the way it is. The good news is the common practice here is for the government to keep everything of historical value and give the finder 75% of the intrinsic value of the find." "What if we're on private property?" Carly asked. "It probably goes to the owner. There would definitely be a legal battle." "And since we're doing this under the auspices of the television show, there are other ownership angles to consider," Slater said. "This could be a mess." "So maybe we're rich and maybe we're not," Dave said. "It's Schrodinger's treasure." "I'm sure this will sort itself out eventually," Slater said. "But for now, I say we cover up the holes where you two klutzes fell through and get back to the job at hand." Bones nodded. "I want to track down whatever it was that attacked us." "You think it was a what and not a who?" Carly asked. Bones merely nodded. They made their way back up to the crew deck, and Bones helped Slater and then Carly climb out. Both were light and agile, so it required little effort. Getting himself and Dave out would take a little more creativity. "Let's gather all the boards and crates we can. We'll pile them up and climb out that way. If that doesn't work, we'll have to dig up enough dirt to make a mound that we can get up on and hope it isn't so heavy that it causes the floor beneath it to collapse." He waited for Dave to reply, but no response was forthcoming. The young cameraman knelt by the old fire pit, poking at the bones that lay there. "Take a look at this." He held up a thick leg bone, a femur if Bones didn't miss his guess. "It's got cuts all over it. Signs that the meat was butchered. We've seen this before on the show. Cannibalism. Frowning, Bones took the femur from Dave and gave it a close look. Maybe not cannibalism. But the cuts. You're not wrong about the cuts, he said. But I don't think this is human, at least not human as we know it.